So what do you do when the world seems like stuck in a lot of difficulty? When things seem really fraught or fragile or conflicted? Feels like I have a lot of conversations with people about that these days. You've read, for argument's sake, you're economists, let's say, front to back, and you know about all the fires happening globally, and you're worried about all of the flooding in Pakistan, and then the Horn of Africa, well, people are starving to death. And you may give money to it, but it feels like a couple of pennies in the drop of a bucket. Or maybe it's closer to home. It's that you send your kid to school, and you know that almost 2/3 of the school is on free lunch. And you don't know quite what to do about that. Or in this town, you drive just a little bit that direction and you find yourself at like 20th and Reed, and you just think, where would I begin to solve sort of the structural difficulties in my own town? Redlining started before I even moved here. Or maybe it's more personal still, something about conflict and the tension that it creates in all of us. The decisions we constantly have to make, pandemic, endemic. Ooh, should I say that because that person will disagree, and the conflict, and it kind of just gets to be a lot. And I don't know about you, but at some point I just sort of find myself thinking like, is there no balm in Gilead? And it seems to me we come up with a sort of 3 major responses to this. One is the kind of like, it just simmers within us. All of the anxiety and all of this stress, it sits there, kind of like a stone, or kind of like something molten. And occasionally something just upsets us, and we have a little apoplectic moment, The policy didn't go our way, the conflict was too much, the suffering we see, and then we just kind of tamp it back down again, but there's something simmering and boiling within us about it. It seems the other option is to decide that we will solve all the problems. We will read every podcast. No, we will listen to every podcast. We will read every newspaper article. We will know every issue. We will knock every door. We will figure out all of the problems for the 1,300 people to the 1,600 problems, and then in the middle of that we'll fall asleep because we're so frazzled we can't take it anymore. Or maybe the more popular option is like, me sending my kid to the public school is not going to change the system. One vote does not matter. Nothing I do changes the global situation. Doesn't matter if I buy an EV or not. And so I'm just going to take a step back, take care of myself, take care of my family, and disengage from it all. Because it doesn't seem to matter. Time just seems to roll on, and problems seem to keep coming, and we find ourselves saying, the harvest has ended, the summer is over, and still, we're not safe. And if you think about Jeremiah, he was in the middle of a collapsing economy, in the middle of an unjust culture, and in the middle of a political structure that was simply falling apart. Things were not good. And of all the prophets, I just personally think that Jeremiah had the most difficult calling. Basically, God says, yeah, things are a hot mess. And I would like you to tell the people that their worship is off-kilter, therefore their society is off-kilter. But here's the deal, Jeremiah. No one's going to listen to you. And so Jeremiah faithfully goes out into the public square and repeats everything God tells him about the people, about how if they just make a different choice, if they turn around and change directions, which is to say, if they repent, then maybe something new will happen. Maybe God can work through them to accomplish some good, to reverse the terror that's going to come. But, as God told Jeremiah, no one listens. And if you flip back a few chapters, you find that at the apex of it all is the religious, priestly elites who keep telling everybody, everything is fine. Don't worry. Comfort, comfort, peace. But see, all these beleaguered people, they're standing in the breadline, and what they see belies the false comfort. It's like extreme gaslighting. because everyone is suffering from a famine. And the invading empire is just standing ready to strike. And yet, people in power keep pursuing their own ends. False worship, false narratives, false weight and measures in the marketplace, and yet they keep crying out to God, please save us. As if God is like Gandalf and gonna wave some wand and magically make everything better. And so the people cry out to God, the harvest is over, the summer is ended, and still we're not saved. But Jeremiah knows it's more difficult than that. That there aren't easy answers about suffering. That actually human agency plays a role. God works through people. And absent in any kind of openness to God or to what God's calling the people to do, the trajectory is set. And it's not a good trajectory. And so Jeremiah cries out from his heart, my grief is upon me. My heart is broken. Come on, God. Don't you hear? But Jeremiah, more than anybody else, knows that God hears. Knows that God is trying to call the people back through him, and that it's just not going anywhere. And so you might expect his response to be a sort of normal human response. Like Jeremiah gets really angry, and he becomes that person like screaming in the center of the town, like yelling at people to repent and just making everything worse and hurting himself. Or you might expect him to just say, okay, you threw me in a cistern, I'll just stay there and disengage from everything. Because you know what? Then I don't have the problems. I can just stay in my cozy well, toss me down a pillow, and I'll just be here and disengage from all of it. Because it's really too much work. But Jeremiah doesn't do any of that. Instead, what Jeremiah does is he weeps. Jeremiah, in this passage today, raises this incredible lament. I am hurt. For the suffering of my people, I am hurt, he says. Because Jeremiah knows that just because he's a prophet doesn't mean he's like better than everybody else. He doesn't mean just because he's a prophet he's worse than everybody else and deserves that cistern. He knows he's actually in it with everybody else. He's not separate from what's happening. He knows and can feel deeply that every word that comes out of his mouth doesn't change anybody's behavior. He feels like even though God is giving him language, he's utterly powerless. And so the best he can do is finally admit the grief that sits in his chest and raise his lament to God and say, is there no physician? Is there no balm in Gilead? And so it's a different kind of thing to raise a lament. And Jeremiah knows that the pain that he's experiencing is generated best when it's finally owned and admitted. That there's something about Jeremiah that he cannot keep it pent up anymore, and he has to just name the truth to God. And interestingly, he does it with a lot of questions. He just asks God some really difficult, unanswerable questions. Because it's not a simple answer about where is God and what is suffering and how is human agency involved. It's a difficult knot to untangle. And Jeremiah doesn't have any answers, but he just needs to tell God about it. And see, lament is an interesting option. Because if we're angry, it just narrows our vision. We can't see any solutions beyond sort of our anger. We shut down. We don't listen anymore. And disengagement actually absents us not only from the world, but from others and from ourselves. But see, lament goes beyond the surface of life to something deeper that requires Jeremiah to own the upset he feels. It's hard to own the upset we feel sometimes. Because it feels like if we do it, it'll be like this tidal wave, and it'll never quit. But actually, Jeremiah owns his lament, and it opens up something different for him. He doesn't stay in it forever. And he trusts that when he cries out about some balm in Gilead, he's not alone, that God actually hears him. And I wonder, too, if it's not actually more, that it's not just God hears him, but that God is in it also. Because, see, the interesting part about this passage is that the Hebrew's oblique. Is it Jeremiah who's crying out about hurt in his poor people? Or is it God who's crying out about hurt in God's poor people? You can actually read that portion of the text either way. Scholars go both directions, and a good chunk of scholars actually think that the Hebrew is intentionally obfuscated, that it is both God and Jeremiah who are raising the lament. And it's a very different thing to say that God hears the lament than that God raises the lament. Because the one raising the lament is in it. They're in solidarity with the pain and the suffering. And so it's not just Jeremiah, the embodied person, who's in the pain and the suffering. It's God who's in the pain and the suffering. It's God who's crying out about the hurt of God's people. God just isn't remote and removed and listens to Jeremiah. God's actually in it with Jeremiah, with the people, in solidarity with them. And so that's qualitatively different when Jeremiah cries out to the God who's with him in it. And these passages come from chapter 8. And I'm here to tell you, there are 44 more chapters of the book of Jeremiah. So this lament is not Jeremiah tossing in the towel. Jeremiah is not done. But what's interesting about it is that periodically he pauses to weep and lament, and something about that gives him the power to go back to the people. This is what I mean about naming the truth and owning the pain. When he does that and he cries out to the God who not just hears him but is with him, something qualitatively changes for Jeremiah. It's not an answer. It's not a solution. It's something about capacity. That God has deeply heard and deeply known Jeremiah's pain, and that kind of is a sort of healing. It's its own kind of balm in Gilead that allows Jeremiah to go back and keep doing the thing that God has called him to do. To keep going back and being in the midst of the suffering and the pain and bearing witness to it with other people. And so I wonder if lament isn't the creative third way that opens up a different way of our being in complexity. It's not a solution. It's not an answer. There are no easy answers. God is too big for that. Life is too complicated for that. Humans are too much a mess for that. But rather than getting angry or disengaging, rather than just living on the surface and never acknowledging our difficulties, what if we took the model of Jeremiah, and when it gets to be too much, we actually dared to cry out to God, you know, my hurt is within me, my grief is in my heart. Is there no physician? Where's the balm in Gilead? And if in daring to raise our lament to God, we realize anew that God just not hears us, but God's with us. Not to offer us an easy answer, but to hold us, to offer us presence. And in doing so, naming truth opens freedom and capacity. I'm not proclaiming that it's easy. I'm not offering you an answer. But I wonder if it's a different way of engaging the problem, of how we faithfully bear witness to God and don't descend into a sorrow that just sinks us like mud, or buoyantly, constantly pretend that everything's fine in a kind of Pollyannish way, but instead split a middle that owns the truth and yet, perhaps, provides the pathway to hope. Jeremiah is an interesting prophet, living in an interesting time. We're all living in an interesting time. Perhaps Jeremiah's lament provides a different model for how we might walk through the complexities, bearing witness to the God who is with us, and pointing everyone to the potential pathway of hope.